It was a warm afternoon when everything changed. A young teen, no more than 17, was walking down the sidewalk, earbuds in, lost in his thoughts, just trying to get home after a long day. The city was bustling around him, people coming and going, lost in their own worlds. But suddenly, the quiet hum of the street was shattered. A police car screeched to a halt beside him, and the door swung open with a force that startled even the most oblivious passerby. The officer inside was a seasoned cop, someone who'd seen it all. His eyes narrowed as they locked onto the teen, scanning him from head to toe. No words exchanged at first, just a tense, crackling silence that only comes when something is about to happen. The teen froze for a split second. Was he being stopped for no reason, or was this just another moment of bad luck? It didn't take long for the officer to make his move. He stepped out of the car, his uniform stiff, his tone firm and authoritative. The teen's heart rate quickened. Was this really happening? The officer's voice broke the air, demanding to know what he was doing in the area. At first, it seemed like any other routine interaction. But there was something in the officer's eyes, a hint of something darker that made the teen's stomach twist. Something felt off. The young man, confused and uneasy, tried to explain himself, but the officer wasn't listening. His questions grew sharper, more pointed. Every word seemed designed to provoke, to challenge the teen in ways he couldn't quite understand. The tension thickened, and with each passing moment, it felt like the situation was spinning out of control. The teen could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the judgment hanging in the air, but he couldn't figure out why. A crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk. People looked on, some unsure whether to intervene, others just watching in silence, as if afraid to make a move. But the teen knew that this wasn't just any encounter. He could sense it in the way the officer's posture shifted, in the way the tone of the conversation grew sharper, more confrontational. What was supposed to be a simple exchange was becoming something much more dangerous. The teen tried to keep his cool, but the officer wasn't having it. He demanded identification, something that seemed unnecessary in the moment, but the teen complied, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his wallet. Every second felt like an eternity. Was this going to escalate? Was it going to be one of those stories that everyone talks about? As he handed over his ID, the officer's eyes flickered over it, and that's when the real tension hit. The teen had no idea what was coming next. The officer's voice dropped low, and for the first time, there was a coldness in his words that made the teen's blood run cold. There was something in the officer's tone, something more than just suspicion. It was as if the officer had already made up his mind about who the teen was, about what he was capable of. It was a moment that would change everything. What happened next was something no one could have predicted. Something that no one would believe unless they had seen it with their own eyes. Just when it seemed like the confrontation couldn't get any more intense, something unexpected happened. The officer took a step back, his hand going to his radio, as if signaling something. But the teen wasn't sure what to make of it. Was this the end of it? Was this where the tension would finally break? But no. The story didn't end there. What unfolded next, in the seconds that followed, would leave everyone involved questioning everything they thought they knew. What happens next is beyond anything you could expect. It's a moment that will make you question the way we see authority, justice, and power. Stay tuned. This story is far from over. As the officer's hand hovered near the radio, the teen's mind raced. Every part of him screamed to run, but his feet felt frozen to the ground. There was something in the officer's eyes, something dark and calculating. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was judgment, an unspoken certainty that things were about to escalate, and that made everything feel more dangerous. The crowd that had gathered seemed to hold its breath, sensing the tension in the air, but none of them moved. There was no one to help, no one to stop this from spiraling. The teen's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to stay calm, to keep his voice steady, but the words felt heavy in his mouth. What if the officer didn't believe him? What if, no matter what he said, this moment would be the start of something much worse? The officer's eyes darted back to the radio, then down to the teen's ID in his hand. He studied it, his gaze lingering on the teen's face for what seemed like an eternity. For a second, the teen thought the officer might actually let him go. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe he was about to be dismissed with a simple warning. But then, without warning, the officer's lips curled into a thin, almost imperceptible sneer. "Where are you headed?" The officer's voice was colder now, his tone almost mocking. The teen hesitated. He had already said he was just walking home, that he lived right around the corner, but the officer wasn't satisfied. There was something about the way he was asking that made it clear that no matter what the teen said, it wouldn't be enough. It wasn't about where he was going. It was about who he was, and what the officer had already decided about him. "I'm just going home," the teen said, his voice steady but his stomach twisting. The officer's eyes narrowed even further. "Home, huh? You expect me to believe that? You think I'm stupid?" The teen flinched at the words, the sharp edge to them making his head spin. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the officer raised his hand, cutting him off. "Don't bother. I don't need to hear your story," the officer said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're just another kid on the street. Nothing special about you." The words hit like a punch to the gut, and the teen felt a wave of confusion and frustration rush over him. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't broken any laws. But in that moment, it felt like none of that mattered. The officer had already made up his mind, already painted him with a brush he didn't deserve. The teen's mind raced. He wanted to say something, to fight back, but what could he say? What was there to argue? He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't some dangerous suspect. But to the officer, he was just another face on the street, just another name on a list of people to watch. He could feel the weight of that assumption bearing down on him. "Turn around," the officer barked suddenly. The command was sharp and commanding, and before the teen could even process it, the officer was moving toward him. For a moment, the world seemed to move in slow motion. The teen's heart skipped a beat as the officer reached for his arm, the grip firm and unyielding. Panic shot through him. Was this really happening? Was the officer really going to arrest him? He had done nothing wrong. His mind scrambled for a way out, but the officer's grip was unshakable. The officer spun him around, forcing his arms behind his back. The teen's breath caught in his throat as the cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He tried to pull away, but the officer held him tight, his movements swift and practiced. Every nerve in the teen's body screamed for him to fight back, but he knew better. He knew that doing anything that might look like resistance could make things worse. "Why are you doing this?" the teen managed to ask, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. The officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. The teen could feel it in the officer's actions, the way he moved, the way his eyes seemed to bore into him. It was like a game, a power struggle, and the teen was losing. The crowd had started to disperse now, the whispers of people's conversations blending into the background. Some were muttering things about the officer, about the teen, but no one was stepping forward. No one was offering help. It felt like the world had turned its back on him. The officer finally spoke again, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can walk around here like you own the place? Think again." The teen's mind was spinning. What did the officer mean by that? Was it the way he looked? The way he dressed? Or was there something deeper, something about who he was that made him an automatic target? The questions swirled around his head, but no answers came. And then, Just as suddenly as it had started, the officer stopped. He didn't say another word. He just stood there for a long, uncomfortable moment, staring at the teen like he was trying to decide something. The teen's breath came in shallow gasps. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his hands aching in the cuffs. The tension in the air was suffocating. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But no one moved. No one spoke. The officer seemed lost in thought, his hands still resting on the radio, as if he was weighing his next move. And then, without warning, the officer took a step back. His eyes flicked to the side, and for a moment, the teen thought he saw something, an almost imperceptible shift in the officer's expression. Something like uncertainty, or maybe even doubt. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that same cold, calculating stare. "Get in the car," the officer ordered, his voice hard again. The teen's chest tightened. What was going on? Was this the moment it all spiraled out of control? Was he really about to be thrown into the back of a squad car, taken away for something he hadn't done? He wanted to protest, to demand an explanation. But the words got stuck in his throat. The officer's gaze was unyielding. He wasn't asking. He was telling. And in that moment, the teen knew that arguing would only make things worse. Without a word, he stepped forward, letting the officer guide him to the car. The air around him felt thick, charged with something he couldn't quite place. Fear? Power? Or something darker, something more dangerous? As they reached the car, the officer opened the door, giving the teen a shove to push him inside. The teen hesitated, his body frozen with uncertainty. What was happening? Where was he being taken? What was going to happen to him? The officer slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the air like a final warning. And then, just as the car pulled away from the curb, something unexpected happened. The teen caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A shadow, moving quickly, too quickly to be just a person walking down the street. It was as if someone, or something, was following them. The teen's pulse quickened. His mind raced. Was this some kind of trap? Was the officer involved in something bigger than just this moment? The car sped down the street, the world outside a blur of lights and shadows, but inside, the tension was unbearable. What was going to happen next? What did the officer know that the teen didn't? The answers were just out of reach, hidden behind the officer's cold, unfeeling exterior. The teen felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him, but there was nothing he could do. He was trapped, caught in the middle of something far beyond his control. As the car turned a corner, the teen's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, but this time, the shadow was gone. Had he imagined it? Or was someone or something really following them? The teen couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was unfolding, and that whatever it was, he was about to get caught up in it. But what that something was, he had no idea. And just like that, the story took another turn. The suspense was thick, the mystery deeper than ever. What would happen next? Would the teen ever get out of this situation? Or was he about to find himself in something far darker than he could have ever imagined? Stay tuned. The truth is coming, but it's more dangerous than you think. The car sped through the city streets, its tires cutting through the night, and with every turn, the teen's unease deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something far bigger than just a routine stop. His thoughts were racing, but each one seemed to collide with another, leaving him more confused than before. He stared out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of flashing lights and shadows, but none of it felt real. It was like everything had shifted, like the world had turned on its head in an instant. The officer beside him said nothing. His hands were on the wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his face set in an unreadable mask. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Every so often, The officer would glance in the rearview mirror, but each time, the teen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way the officer was driving, the sharp turns, the quick glances, he wasn't just trying to get to some station or office. He was avoiding something. Or maybe someone. The teen's heart hammered in his chest. Was he being taken somewhere safe? Or was this the beginning of something far worse? The officer had acted like he already knew everything about him, like this encounter had been planned from the start. But who was really in control here? Was the officer acting alone? Or was there something bigger, something behind the scenes that had set all of this in motion? The teen glanced out the window again, his mind racing with questions. The city was familiar, but now it felt foreign. The streets that once felt like home now seemed like a maze, and he was trapped in the middle of it. Every corner he turned only made it harder to see the way out. He knew he had to stay calm, keep his wits about him, but it felt like every breath he took was harder than the last. And then, in the distance, a car's headlights flashed in the rearview mirror. At first, it seemed like nothing, just another vehicle driving behind them. But the officer's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white against the dark of the night. The car in the rearview mirror wasn't just any car, it was moving faster, closing the gap between them. For the first time since they'd driven off, the officer spoke, his voice low and cold. "Stay quiet," he muttered, his eyes flicking between the road and the mirror. The teen's mind raced. What was happening? Who was that car? Why was it following them? The officer pressed the gas pedal harder, the car jerking forward as they sped through the streets. The headlights behind them grew brighter, the car tailing them with unnerving precision. It was like the driver knew exactly where they were going, like they had planned this chase from the start. The teen's stomach twisted. Who was out there? Was this just a random car, or was there something more to this? He glanced at the officer, who seemed unbothered by Carr's pursuit. But there was no way the officer couldn't notice it. He was driving faster, trying to lose the tail, but the car behind them was relentless. It was almost as if the officer had expected it, and now the chase was on. The teen's heart raced as the tension in the air thickened. What did the officer know that he didn't? The streets blurred around them, the car screeching around tight corners, its engine roaring like a beast. But no matter how fast they went, the car behind them stayed right on their tail, not giving an inch. The teen felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. What if this was all part of a plan? What if he was just a pawn in some bigger game, some mess that he had no control over? He looked out the window again, trying to make sense of the situation. The city seemed to stretch endlessly, like a maze with no exits. But then, his eyes caught something, a figure in the shadows, standing motionless on the sidewalk, watching the car. The teen's heart skipped a beat. Had that person been there the whole time? Was it someone connected to the officer, or was it someone else entirely? His mind was spinning. Was he being followed by more than one person? Was he in danger from all sides? The officer's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Hold on," he ordered. His voice was tense, but the command was clear. The officer jerked the wheel sharply, sending the car careening into an alleyway, narrowly avoiding a collision with a dumpster. The teen's body was pressed back into the seat as they zoomed through the narrow space, the headlights from the pursuing car still flashing in the rearview mirror. The officer's focus was absolute now, his hands moving with precision, maneuvering the car like a skilled driver. But no matter how fast they went, the car behind them was still there, closing in. The alleyway was a dead end, and the teen could feel his pulse in his throat. There was no way out. But just as the officer approached the end of the alley, something incredible happened. The pursuing car swerved sharply to the right, screeching its tires as it narrowly missed a parked truck. The officer didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He hit the gas again, tearing through the alley, but when he reached the end, he was met with a sight that made his blood run cold. The alley opened up into a large, dark parking lot. But it wasn't empty. In fact, it was far from it. The lot was filled with black SUVs parked haphazardly, their engines running in dead of night. The officer's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, and the teen saw his grip tighten on the wheel. This wasn't a random chase. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. This was something planned. Something orchestrated. The car behind them slowed, finally coming to a stop in the middle of the lot. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The officer's gaze shot to the rearview mirror, and the teen could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. What was going on? Who were these people, and why were they after them? The officer didn't speak. He didn't need to. The tension in the air was palpable, and the teen could see the decision forming in the officer's mind. The parking lot was a trap, a dead end, and now they were surrounded. The teen's mind raced. Was this the end of the road? Or was this just the beginning of something much darker? The officer shifted the car into park, his face stone cold. He didn't look at the teen. He didn't have to. The officer knew what was coming next. But the teen didn't. He had no idea what was happening. He couldn't make sense of it. All he knew was that he was caught in the middle of something far bigger than he could have imagined. The air was thick with anticipation, and the teen's heart thudded in his chest. Who were the people in the SUVs? Why had they been following them? And most importantly, what were they going to do next? The questions lingered in the silence, but the answers seemed farther out of reach than ever before. The car came to a jolting stop, the engine rumbling as the officer's grip on the wheel tightened. The teen's breath was shallow, his heart hammering in his chest as he glanced nervously out the window. The parking lot loomed like a trap, the black SUVs surrounding them like silent sentinels, their headlights cutting through the darkness. There was nowhere to go. No escape. For a moment, everything felt suspended, like time had stopped. The officer didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, staring ahead at the sea of vehicles. The teen couldn't understand it. What was this? What had they walked into? The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the sound of the engine ticking as it cooled. The officer's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his jaw clenched tight. The teen followed his gaze, but the mirror only reflected the empty lot behind them. The car that had been tailing them was gone now, its headlights swallowed by the darkness. But the unease in the air had only grown thicker. A door slammed in the distance. The sound echoed through the lot, sharp and sudden, and the teen froze. Footsteps approached, heavy and purposeful, each step making his heart race faster. He glanced nervously at the officer, but the man hadn't moved. The officer's face was an unreadable mask of stone, his eyes locked straight ahead. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even reacting. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the teen could feel a knot tighten in his stomach. Whoever was coming wasn't just walking, there was an intention in the way they moved. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. What did they want? Who were they? Were they here for him? Or for the officer? Or was this about something else entirely? The officer's voice broke the silence, cold and clipped. Stay down. Don't make a sound. The teen's mind raced. What did that mean? Was it a warning? A command? He wanted to ask what was going on, wanted to demand answers, but he could barely breathe, let alone speak. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating, and each passing second seemed to stretch longer than the last. The footsteps stopped just outside the car. The teen could feel the weight of someone's gaze through the tinted windows, their eyes searching, studying. His pulse was pounding in his ears, and he tried to control his breathing, to calm himself, but it was impossible. His entire body was on edge, ready to react to whatever came next. Then, a knock sharp, demanding came on the window. The officer didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the teen, his eyes still locked straight ahead. The knock came again, louder this time, and the teen's heart skipped a beat. Whoever was out there wasn't going away. The officer's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in the way he held himself. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles going white. He was preparing for something. But what? The teen swallowed hard, his throat dry, his hands trembling at his sides. He wanted to shout, to ask what was happening, but the officer's earlier command echoed in his mind, "Stay down. Don't make a sound." He obeyed, pressing himself into the seat, trying to disappear into the shadows, hoping that maybe, just maybe, whoever was out there wouldn't notice him. But the knock came again, and this time, the officer slowly turned his head, his eyes narrowing in the rearview mirror. The teen didn't dare move. He could hear the low murmur of voices outside the car, too quiet to make out, but unmistakably tense. There was an urgency in the way they spoke, a sharpness to the words that made his skin crawl. This wasn't just some random encounter. This was something deliberate. Something planned. Without warning, the officer opened the door. The teen's breath caught in his throat as the officer stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate, like a man who knew exactly what was happening and what he had to do next. The teen's eyes stayed glued to the officer, but he couldn't see what was going on outside. He could only hear the muffled voices growing louder, more intense, the steps of more figures gathering around the officer. The teen could barely breathe. He had no idea what to do, where to look. His mind spun with possibilities, none of them good. What did these people want with the officer? What did they want with him? He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? But the more he thought about it, the less sure he felt. This whole situation didn't feel random. He had to be part of it. He had to be caught up in whatever game this was. A voice, low, gravelly, cut through the air, too close for comfort. "We know who you are. Don't try to play dumb." The words hit like a blow to the gut. The teen's mind spun, trying to make sense of it. Who were they talking to? The officer? Him? The feeling of being watched, of being trapped, only grew stronger. The officer's voice responded, calm but unmistakably hard. "I don't have time for this." There was a brief, tense silence, followed by a sharp command. "Get in the car. Now." The teen's stomach dropped. The command wasn't directed at him, but at the officer. But the way the voice said it, the authority behind it, made it clear that this wasn't a request. This was an order. The officer didn't hesitate. He stepped away from the car, his back straight, his jaw clenched. He walked toward one of the black SUVs, the doors of which had opened just moments before. The teen couldn't see who was inside, but he didn't need to. The whole scene was too calculated, too precise. The officer knew what was happening. And he wasn't fighting it. Everything inside the teen screamed to get out of the car, to run. To find some way to escape. But he was frozen, his body too stiff with fear to move. What was going on? What was the officer involved in? Why was he so calm? And what was this group waiting for? Another figure stepped forward, their silhouette only visible for a moment before they moved to the officer's side. There was a low murmur of conversation, but it was too far away for the teen to hear. He strained, trying to catch any words, any hint of what was about to happen. But it was no use. The voices were muffled, the air heavy with uncertainty. Then, in one swift motion, the officer turned and started walking back to the car. He didn't look at the teen. He didn't say a word. He just climbed into the driver's seat, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror once more. The teen felt his pulse quicken, a sinking feeling growing in his chest. The officer started the engine, the car roaring to life, but before they could move, another figure appeared at the window. This time, the teen could see them more clearly, a tall figure, dressed in all black, their face hidden behind a mask. A chill ran through the teen as the figure leaned down to the window, their eyes meeting his through the glass. "This isn't over," the figure said, their voice low, barely more than a whisper. "It's only just begun." And with that, they disappeared into the darkness, leaving the teen with more questions than answers, his heart pounding in his chest, as the car slowly pulled away, the sound of the engines fading into the night. The tension hung in the air, thick and heavy, and the teen had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. As the car rumbled through the night, the teen's mind was a whirlwind. The figure's warning still echoed in his ears, its weight pressing down on him like a suffocating cloud. It's only just begun. What did that even mean? He had no answers, no clue as to what kind of game he was trapped in. Was he a target? Was he a pawn in something bigger than he could understand? The officer remained silent, his hands steady on the wheel as they sped down the empty streets, each turn more calculated than the last. The quiet hum of the engine filled the car, the only sound in the otherwise oppressive atmosphere. The teen couldn't bring himself to speak, to ask anything. The words seemed to stick in his throat. He was too scared, too confused to form any coherent questions. But more than that, there was something inside him telling him that speaking up wasn't going to change anything. Whatever this was, it was bigger than both of them. Then, as if to break the tension, the officer's voice sliced through the air, cold and matter-of-fact. "You're not just caught in the middle of this. You're at the center." The teen's heart skipped a beat. The officer's words were like a punch to the gut, the truth of it crashing over him. The center of what? What was going on, and why was he the one involved in this mess? But before he could react, the officer continued, his tone even darker than before. "Those people out there. They're part of something bigger. You're not just a witness. You're connected. And that's why they'll come for you." The teen's mind raced, trying to make sense of the officer's words. Connected to what? To whom? He had no clue. But the officer's words had the sting of truth to them, and every instinct inside him screamed that things were only going to get worse. There was no turning back now. The officer glanced at him briefly, his gaze cold but not unkind. "You're not safe," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not until this is over." The teen could feel a knot in his stomach, a deep sense of dread creeping up his spine. What did that mean? What would it take to be safe again? And who was going to make sure that happened? Suddenly, the officer jerked the wheel, pulling the car off the main road and onto a winding side street. The teen's heart raced, his breath quickening as the car sped faster. The officer's eyes were scanning the mirrors constantly, his face tense with anticipation. "What's going on?" the teen finally managed to ask, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound calm. The officer didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the road ahead, the tension in his jaw unmistakable. But then, he spoke again, his voice low, almost inaudible over the sound of the engine. "They've found us. We're being tracked." The words hit the teen like a wave. His mind tried to process it, but everything felt like it was moving too fast. They were being tracked? By whom? How? He had no time to ask more questions before the officer slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into a sharp turn. The tires screeched against the pavement as the car swerved into an alley. The teen's body slammed against the seat as the officer floored the gas again, the engine roaring to life as they sped down a narrow, dimly lit passage. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows against the walls, making it hard to tell what was real and what was a figment of his panicked mind. Then, another car appeared, its headlights blinding in the darkness, The officer's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. The teen's stomach dropped. They were being chased again. But this time, there was something more menacing about it. The pursuing car wasn't just following, they were closing in. Fast. Too fast. Hold on. The officer shouted, his voice strained, his eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the narrow road ahead. The teen felt the pressure building, his pulse pounding in his ears as they swerved through the alley, the car behind them staying right on their tail. It was like they were trapped in a high-speed chase with no way out. The officer was driving like a man possessed, his eyes wild with urgency, but the teen could tell that even the officer didn't know how to lose the car. Suddenly, the alley opened up, and the officer made a sharp right turn, heading down a dead-end street. The teen's breath caught in his throat. There was nowhere to go. They were cornered. The pursuing car had already closed the gap, its headlights bearing down on them. The officer hit the brakes hard, spinning the wheel to the left, aiming the car toward the only possible escape. But just as they turned, the pursuing car followed, screeching to a halt right behind them, trapping them in a narrow space between the walls of the alley. The officer's hand darted to the glove compartment, pulling out something metal, something dangerous. The teen's heart dropped to his stomach. Was this going to escalate to violence? The officer's gaze flicked to the teen, his eyes hard. Stay low, he ordered, his voice low, yet somehow filled with a sense of finality. Before the teen could react, there was a loud bang, a sharp, deafening sound that echoed off the walls. The officer's car jerked forward, the engine sputtering as the tires screeched. The pursuing car had fired at them, a warning shot. The teen's mind raced. This wasn't just a chase anymore. This wasn't some random stop. This was serious. The officer slammed the gas pedal to the floor, speeding down the dead-end street with reckless abandon. The pursuing car followed, but as the officer glanced into the rearview mirror, his expression shifted. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. Something like resignation. The teen didn't know what it meant, but it made his blood run cold. The officer turned his head, his voice low. You need to know something. The people after us aren't who you think they are. The teen's eyes widened in confusion. What did he mean? Who were they? But before he could ask, the officer looked back ahead, and the night exploded into chaos. A second shot rang out closer this time. The sound of glass shattering followed by a terrifying screech as the car lost control. The teen's stomach dropped as the world around him spun out of control. The officer's grip on the wheel tightened, and the car careened into the night, the danger closer than ever before. What was coming next? And who were the people who were hunting them? He had no answers, only the terrifying feeling that the chase had just begun. The car slammed into the barricade at the end of the alley, the impact rattling both the officer and the teen as the airbags deployed with a violent hiss. The world seemed to slow, spinning as the dust from the collision clouded the air, and the engine sputtered to a halt. For a moment, everything was eerily silent, the only sound the slow, rhythmic ticking of the car cooling down. The teen's heart raced. He blinked through the haze, his body still jolted from the crash, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The officer was frozen in place, one hand gripping the wheel, the other reaching toward the glove compartment again. The pursuit car had come to a stop just behind them, the headlights glaring through the shattered rearview mirror. There was no way out. Then, the officer's voice broke through tense silence, his tone barely above a whisper. Stay down. And don't make a sound. The teen nodded instinctively, though his mind was a mess of confusion. Why hadn't they tried to escape earlier? What was happening? But there was no time for more questions. The sound of footsteps approached car, heavy and deliberate. Someone was coming. The officer's hand shifted from the glove compartment to the door handle. They're here, he said flatly, as if it wasn't the first time he'd been in this situation. He opened the door slowly, carefully, as if he'd done this countless times before. His eyes locked with the teen's for a brief second before he stepped out, his posture straight, a strange calmness settling over him. The teen watched, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to do something, anything, but his body was frozen, his hands shaking too violently to move. He kept his head down as the footsteps drew closer, the tension in the air so thick it felt like it might suffocate him. Then, the door to the officer's side swung open, and a figure stepped inside the car. The teen froze, trying to make out their features through the darkness, but the figure was cloaked in shadow. A low voice filled the air, as chilling as it was familiar. "Well, well. I didn't expect to see you here." The teen's heart skipped. That voice. He knew it. It was the same voice from earlier, the one that had given the warning. His mind raced. What was going on? Why had they come back? The officer didn't flinch. "I knew you'd come after us. Just didn't expect it to be this quick." The figure chuckled, a dry, almost mocking sound. "You've always been quick, haven't you? But you're not the one I'm interested in tonight." The teen's throat tightened. This wasn't just about the officer. It never had been. It was about him. "What do you want from me?" he finally managed to croak, his voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't know who he was talking to, but the words were out before he could stop them. The figure's attention shifted to him, and for the first time, he felt exposed. There was something predatory in their gaze, something dangerous that made his stomach twist. "Oh, it's not what I want from you," the figure replied, their voice low and smooth. "It's what you're going to give me." Before the teen could react, the officer spoke again, his voice stern. "Get out of the car. Now." The figure hesitated, but only for a second. Then, without a word, they stepped back out of the car, vanishing into the shadows. The teen barely had time to process what was happening before the officer slammed the door shut with a force that shook the entire vehicle. "Get out." "Now," the officer repeated, his eyes flicking to the teen in a way that made the air feel even heavier. The teen didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled out of the car, his legs shaky beneath him as he stumbled into the night. The officer was already a few steps ahead, his silhouette cutting through the darkness like a shadow. They were in the middle of nowhere, the alleyway stretching out behind them like an endless tunnel. There were no cars, no sounds of life. Just the eerie silence. The officer turned to him, his face unreadable. "I know you're scared. But we're running out of time," the officer said, his voice sharp but oddly calm. He didn't seem scared, didn't seem to have any doubt that everything was under control. The teen, however, felt his heart racing. "What's going on?" the teen finally demanded, his voice cracking. "Why are they after me? What do they want from me?" The officer's eyes narrowed. "You don't know, do you?" he muttered, more to himself than to the teen. But then, he met the teen's gaze again. "They're using you. You're part of a bigger picture than you realize." Before the teen could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles broke through the silence. Multiple headlights appeared in the distance, moving fast. Panic surged through the teen's chest. This was it. Whoever they were, whoever was coming for them, they were closing in. The officer turned to the teen. "I'm sorry. But this is the only way." "What? What do you mean?" The teen's voice trembled as the officer pulled something from his jacket pocket, a small device, no bigger than a cell phone. The officer held it up, his fingers tapping the screen. "They've been tracking us. But now, we have a chance to turn the tables." With a sudden movement, the officer slammed his hand onto the device. The screen flashed, a burst of light filling the area as the devices in the approaching cars began to glitch, their engines sputtering. The teen could hardly believe his eyes. The cars were losing control, the headlights flickering as the vehicles ground to a halt, one by one. It was like the officer had somehow disabled their systems. But how? And why? As the chaos unfolded, the officer grabbed the teen by the arm and pulled him toward a nearby building, the sounds of malfunctioning cars fading behind them. They ran, the night closing in around them. The teen's mind spun with confusion, but one thing was clear: the officer had planned this all along. The teen was no longer just a bystander. He was part of whatever was happening, and whatever was coming next, it was too late to turn back. But just as they reached the building, the officer paused, his expression changing. His eyes flicked to the sky. A low hum filled the air, distant but unmistakable. The officer's face hardened. "They know we're here," he said quietly. The teen's stomach dropped. Something in the officer's eyes told him that whatever was coming next, it was the final game changer. And the real danger was only just beginning. The officer pulled the teen into the building's entrance, his movements quick, but with a certain calmness that unnerved the teen. It was as if everything had been planned, every move meticulously thought out. The teen's heart pounded, but his mind was still racing, processing the events that had unfolded so quickly. Why had the officer been so prepared? Why had he dragged the teen into this mess? Inside, the building was dark, the faint glow from a few flickering overhead lights barely illuminating the hallway. They moved swiftly through the dimly lit corridors, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls, but there was no time to stop. No time to ask questions. "Where are we going?" the teen managed to ask, his voice hoarse, fear still thick in his throat. The officer didn't answer right away, his gaze darting around as they moved deeper into the building. It felt like a maze, with endless hallways and doors that led to more and more darkness. The air was thick, stale, as if it hadn't been breathed in for years. "We're almost there," the officer said, his voice low. "And you need to understand something." The teen felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" The officer stopped suddenly, turning to face him. For the first time since this nightmare began, the officer's eyes held something that resembled empathy. "You're more than just a bystander. You were never just a witness to this. You were the target all along." The words hit the teen like a punch. He had known something wasn't right, but hearing it confirmed felt like the world was crashing around him. "Target?" the teen echoed. "I don't understand." The officer took a deep breath, his hands shaking just slightly as he ran them through his hair. "It's complicated. They've been monitoring you for a while now. Your entire life, really. They've been keeping track of everything: your moves, your decisions, your connections. You're the key to their plans." The teen stared at him, his mind struggling to wrap around the officer's words. "Why me?" he asked. "What do they want with me?" The officer's eyes flickered, the tension in his face tightening. "Because you have something they want, something you don't even know about yet." Before the teen could process what he meant, there was a sudden sound: footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The officer's face hardened, and he grabbed the teen's arm, pulling him down a side hallway. "Stay low," he whispered urgently. The teen crouched instinctively, his pulse racing. The footsteps were getting closer, and with them, the sense of danger intensified. His breath hitched in his chest. They weren't just running anymore, they were being hunted. They ducked into a small room, the door clicking shut behind them. The officer moved quickly, locking the door with a key from his pocket. There was a moment of silence before he turned to the teen, his expression grave. "They're closing in," the officer said, his voice strained. "You need to know everything now. There's no more time." The teen's mind was spinning. "What are you talking about? Who are they?" The officer closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, His words were slow, deliberate, like he was carefully considering each one. They're an organization, a network, really. And they've been tracking people like you for years. People with potential. People who can shift the balance. Shift the balance? The teen repeated, still not following. They're after something bigger than control. They want influence. They want power. They've been manipulating people, pulling strings, setting up scenarios, and you're the one they've been preparing for. The one they need. The teen's head spun. I don't get it. I'm just me. I'm not some sort of special agent or anything. The officer's eyes softened, but only for a moment. That's exactly what they want you to believe. You have a part to play. A role in what comes next. The teen shook his head, feeling the weight of the officer's words settling in. This was too much. He couldn't process it all at once. I don't want any part of this, he said, his voice firm now, though his heart was still racing. I just want to go home. The officer studied him for a moment before replying. You can't go home. Not anymore. They'll never let you. A chill ran through the teen's body. The officer was right, he couldn't go back. Not to his normal life. It was gone now, like it had been erased from existence. His only option was to keep moving forward, wherever that would lead. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed down the hallway, followed by shouting. The teen's heart skipped a beat as the officer grabbed his arm again, pulling him to his feet. We're out of time, the officer said, his voice low but urgent. Follow me. Now. They moved quickly, slipping through darkened corridors, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. Every step felt heavier, like they were being chased by an unseen force. The officer led them through a maze of rooms, twisting through hallways and staircases, always staying just one step ahead. Finally, they reached a set of steel doors. The officer pushed them open, revealing a dimly lit room with multiple screens flashing various images, surveillance footage, maps, coded messages. It was a control room, but it felt cold, impersonal. We're safe for now, the officer said, breathing heavily. But we have to act fast. This place is about to be compromised. The teen glanced around, his mind still trying to catch up. What is this place? The officer didn't look at him directly. He was focused on the screens. This is where they monitor everything. This is where the final step happens. The teen's heart pounded in his chest. Final step? What do you mean? The officer turned to him, his expression unreadable. This is where they'll either succeed or fail. The words hung in the air for a long moment before the officer reached for a keypad on the wall. He typed in a long sequence of numbers, his fingers moving with precision. The screens blinked, then shifted, displaying a new set of images of people the teen didn't recognize. They were scattered across different locations, moving like pieces on a chessboard. These are the others, the officer explained. The ones who have been activated. They've been waiting for you. The teen frowned. Activated? What does that mean? The officer paused, looking at him with a cold, almost detached expression. They've been trained. Groomed even. Just like you. And now it's your turn. The last piece of the puzzle? Before the teen could respond, the door to the room burst open, and several figures stepped inside, men in dark uniforms, their faces obscured by masks. The officer was already moving, grabbing a device from the table and hitting a button. The screens flickered and then went black. The figures froze for a split second, before raising their weapons. Move! The officer shouted, and before the teen could even process what was happening, the officer pushed him forward, toward a narrow hallway leading out of the room. The teen didn't think, he just ran, his legs carrying him on instinct, the sound of boots pounding behind them growing louder by the second. They ran through the building, weaving in and out of corridors, until they burst out into the night air. The teen could see the distant lights of the city skyline, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like they were running into an unknown future. As they reached a parked car, the officer shoved the teen into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind him. He jumped into the driver's side, starting the engine with a roar. The tires squealed as they sped off into the night, the city fading into the distance. The teen was silent, his mind still reeling. What had just happened? Who were these people? What did they want from him? The officer glanced over at him, his expression unreadable. "It's over," he said quietly. The teen stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "It's not over. It's only just begun." The officer smiled slightly, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was more like he was preparing himself for something inevitable. "No. It's over. You're free. They'll never come for you again." The teen swallowed hard, trying to process it all. His world had been turned upside down, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time.